Welcome to the Supporting Every Student Learning Series and an Introduction to Trauma-Informed Practice. I'm Margaret Casey and I'm a psychologist with the Calgary Board of Education. And over the last 10 years, I've had the opportunity to work with a variety of professionals in incorporating trauma-informed practice into school settings. So here today, I'm going to share some of the things I've learned along the way, as well as I represent a collective wisdom of a number of educators that I've worked with, and a number of them are rock stars in the field. So what's the buzz about trauma-informed practice? It's a term we're starting to hear in a lot of different settings. So you may work in the justice field or health or child development fields and education. We're going to take a quick look about actually what's happening. What is the buzz out there? And we're going to take a look at what's happening in the US, and then we're going to take a little closer look to home. So in 2004, mass advocates and advocates for children, sorry, I always trip over that, and Harvard Law School formed a partnership to create the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative. A year later, they published the seminal piece of work, Helping Traumatized Children Learn. And that publication set a foundation for understanding the impact of trauma on children, and more specifically, the impact of trauma on learning. So fast forward to 2013, and Volume 2 of Helping Traumatized Children Learn was published. And it focuses on creating and advocating for trauma-sensitive schools. The work that has taken place in Massachusetts over the years by a wide range of organizations has created Massachusetts as a leader in the field of creating trauma-sensitive schools. And as a result of all of that work, in 2014, the Safe and Supportive Schools Framework was enacted into law by the Governor of Massachusetts. And that law has provisions for creating inclusive environments and promoting student well-being and trauma sensitivity. We're going to take a look now, go across the country to Los Angeles, California. In 2015, a class action lawsuit was filed against the Compton Unified School District. And the suit argues that the school district discriminates against students who have experienced multiple traumatic events by failing to accommodate the neurobiological impacts of exposure to trauma and on a young person's ability to learn. The suit also goes on to claim that the district frequently punished and excluded these children in ways that made it almost impossible for them to succeed in school. The suit demands that the district incorporate proven practices that address trauma in exactly the same way that public schools have adapted and evolved in the past decades to help students who've experienced physical and other barriers to learning. That suit is still before the courts. If we take a look at what's happening at a policy level in the United States, the Safe, Healthy, and Ready to Learn Consensus Policy Report was published in May 2015 from Futures Without Violence. The report was developed in partnership with leaders from justice, education, health, and child development, and it calls for trauma-sensitive school as their major recommendation. Is designed to promote positive school climates, be trauma-sensitive, and the important piece, raise achievement. So as a result of some of these policy reports that have been published and how they've been advocated for, this Every Student Succeed Act was signed by President Obama in December 2015, and that replaces the long controversial 14 years it's been in place, the No Child Left Behind law. And it includes provisions for trauma-informed practices in schools specifically. So as I promised, we'd come take a little look closer to home. And the province of British Columbia in May 2013 published its Trauma-Informed Practice Guide. The guide was developed by, on behalf of actually BC Provincial Mental Health and Substance Abuse Planning Council, and the guide is intended to support the translation of trauma-informed principles into practice. So what's happening in Alberta? So I just want to give you an example of some of the work that's taking place at the policy level and some of the organizations that are doing that work closer to home. The Alberta Family Wellness Initiative began around 2007 with the Building Blocks for a Healthy Future conference. So that particular conference brought policymakers from leading experts in brain and child development to talk about the science and the implications of that science on negative health outcomes for such as addiction. Additional projects along the way have been added, and they've expanded the mandate to include knowledge translation and mobilization. So they're doing some fantastic work in our own province. So that leads us to Alberta's amended School Act. And as of June 1st, 2015, amendments to the School Act contained in Bill 10 came into force. There were new responsibilities added for school boards, also for parents and students. And that act is to ensure that all students and school staff are provided with a welcoming, caring, respectful, and safe learning environment. Those environments must also respect diversity and foster a sense of belonging. So Alberta Education, what's happening there? December 2015, the information related to trauma-informed practice was launched on their website. And a quote from that site talks about trauma-informed practice as it creates a school-wide focus which creates a shared understanding and common language about how to create a welcoming, caring, respectful school, safe schools. So that's the buzz. There's a lot of different things that are happening in relation to trauma-informed practice and a lot happening close to home. But what is trauma-informed practice and what does it mean in schools? So that's what we're going to take a look at. But we're also, just to have things make some sense to you, if you're not familiar with some of these concepts, we're just going to touch briefly on what trauma is, toxic stress, and a term called adverse childhood experiences. Then we're going to take a quick snapshot at some of the research about is this stuff working out there, and we're going to look at some solutions that work. So whenever we talk to schools about trauma-informed practice, one of the very first things we do is be very explicit about the difference between trauma-informed practice and trauma-specific interventions. So trauma-specific interventions are treating trauma through therapeutic interventions involving practitioners with very specialized skill sets. So what we're talking about there are psychologists or registered social workers, etc., who have specific training in processing traumatic material. We are not asking schools to take that on. What we are talking about is principles of trauma-informed practice that anybody can apply. So that could be the bus driver, your lunchroom supervisor, the staff in your front office, to your principal, down to your teachers. You bet. Anybody within a school. If you come in contact with a kid, you can be trauma-informed. So what does that actually mean? That means having some awareness of the impact of trauma on the brain and the body. Okay? That means understanding the importance of safety. That means looking at how do we collaborate to create those sense of safety in a school environment, and strengths-based. And we have to also pay a lot of attention to cultural, historical, and gender issues. So that's what we mean by being trauma-informed. You also hear when you talk about trauma-informed practice, people referring to it as a paradigm shift. So what is that paradigm shift in a school? So what it means is that we're taking a shift from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. So when we focus on maybe a series of behaviors that are being presented to us with a kid in a classroom, and we're only paying attention to those behaviors, we're actually not paying attention to the context in which this kid's coming into your school and the types of experiences that they may have that may be impacting them today. So when we shift to what's happened to you, it actually starts to allow us to peel back some layers. And when we peel back the layers, we can start to be really curious. And that curiosity leads to different interventions that we might be looking or programming for a kid. So what does it mean to become trauma-informed? It means a gradual integration of these trauma concepts and trauma-sensitive responses into daily practice. It's really gradual. You can find that there's so much research and things we can learn that it's actually something that takes a while for us to integrate into our own practice. What it looks like to be trauma-informed varies across settings and it varies across individuals. And sometimes, and I've witnessed this, it can create an organized shift in culture. And those things take a bit of time, but really they can be pretty remarkable in terms of the results. So when we ask about trauma-informed practice in a school, people always say, well, what does it look like? What are you talking about? And when we look at it, we think, okay, have you ever had that experience of walking into a school or a classroom and you think, there's something really great about being here? It's a place I'd love my kids to hang out at if they were in this class. I'd like to perhaps work here, or if I'm a parent I'm coming in, I feel welcomed. And there just really seems to be a lot going on. So a lot of times when you talk to those in those classrooms, and maybe the educators or those who are there to support, they often talk a lot about things of being from a gut, or I really have just been doing this a long time, I really know my kids, but when we look at trauma-informed practice in schools, how we view it is taking some of this new science that there is exploding around us and how it impacts kids and learning. So the science, and we look at trauma-informed practice meeting the art and science of good teaching practice. Whenever you talk about these concepts with educators, they'll often look at you and go, yeah, I already do that. Exactly. So we're not talking about coming at things from a completely different way in a school. We're actually just talking about putting it up a notch with a trauma lens and applying what we know. Trauma lens, often heard a term you hear about as well. So how do we define it in schools? We think about, obviously, starting as a starting point, having a developmental lens. And in schools, we're pretty good at that. We have a pretty good sense of what a normal trajectory would be for kids and what are some of the milestones they would be reaching. And having a trauma lens meaning being really curious about what we're seeing, understanding normative development, and being really careful about judgment and jumping to conclusions. So sometimes people get a little nervous because they think, oh, well, not every kid has a trauma history, and exactly. So we don't want to assume that any behavior that we are seeing in a school setting is actually always trauma related, because it isn't. It's just about being really curious about what we're seeing, and again, how we might change what we're doing based on that. So a few times now I've talked about this science and what is it. So I don't have time today to go into any depth at all, and I'm also not a neuroscientist, so there's a lot of people who would be a lot better at doing it than me. But in this learning series, we have some really fantastic speakers who are addressing those concepts. And Dr. Nicole Sharon from Palix Foundation does 3 sessions on brain development. Highly recommend you check it out. Okay, so what I am going to talk a little bit about, just because you can't really talk about this stuff without mentioning the Center on the Developing Child out of Harvard University. They do amazing work. And they really are setting the standard for understanding the impact of trauma and adverse childhood experiences on an individual. And they've, so far, there could be more as we go along, they've got 5 key concepts. I'm just going to mention them briefly here. Brain architecture, serve and return, toxic stress, executive functions and self-regulation, and resilience. So if you get a chance, go check out their website, because they have amazing videos and other information that you can download that will help you understand the science. Okay, so trauma, what is it? It can be a bit of a complex answer, especially if we're talking about trauma in relation to children and adults. So for our purposes, we're going to keep it really simple. And we're going to understand trauma in that it may arise from a single event or multiple events. It's any event that interferes with a person's ability to cope and integrate the experience. It can be an experience of or witnessing of a perceived threat to life, integrity of the body, and sense of self. And here's another thing, is it's cumulative over time. It can be across the lifespan. So when we're talking about trauma, it's something that we have to pay attention to. If you've had an event that took place, say, when you were 15, it was a big one. And then you had another similar one, say, when you were 24, not as big, but it was something significant. And then when you're 40, you have something minor happen. And it could be the thing that tips you over the edge because of the accumulation of these events, if they're not processed and if you haven't worked through those things. So when we talk about kids, the reason why trauma impacts kids differently is because of development. And the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has put a bunch of gurus together who have initially, they took a look at what's a term called complex trauma, and they established that there were 7 domains of impairment. So they are, 1 is attachment, number 2 is biology and brain and body, affect regulation, so that's feeling behaviors and being able to identify, modulate, and express your emotional worlds. dissociation. I always just call that, I went to work in schools, that's the lights are on and nobody's home. Somebody's sort of checked out there. Behavioral control, you know these kids in your schools, you're well aware of them. But behavioral can both be things like substance use, the obvious behavioral things that we might recognize, but it could be also eating disorder. There can be a lot of different things we start to see percolate for kids. Cognition is number 6, and that's the thinking and learning stuff, and self-concept. So because there's multiple layers, they lead to complex outcomes. So I'm not going to lie to you, some of these kids are really challenging to program for in a school. So what would that look like? So if we're talking about those domains of impairment, we've got some kids may come in with expectations of harm from the world and others, difficulty forming relationships with their friends, with peers, and with adults. We're talking about difficulty managing and regulating the feelings, behavior, damaged sense of self, developmental deficits. So we start to talk about the teaching and learning. We get problems here with problem solving, not understanding cause and effect, not being able to take another person's perspective. And so as you might see, there can be some academic challenges there. What does it look like in a school? So how can I imagine this? Try to put a kid in my head. So it's either avoid or withdrawal. I'm checking out, not participating in any of the academic and other types of activities that are taking place. Kids may sometimes seem really clingy and needy, and oftentimes you see this with elementary school kids. They often appear manipulative and controlling. I hear that one is probably one of the most common. They're engaged in avoidance behaviors, and they can be confrontative, hostile, and complain of sickness, stomach aches, headaches, not sleeping. So that's how it shows up in schools. Because of all of that, you start to see a lot of common labels. Oppositional, manipulative, I threw in twice because that's the one I hear the most often. Unmotivated, antisocial, defiant, aggressive. So those are the sorts of labels that you can start to hear that can bubble up in talking about these kids. So here's the thing. I gotta look at the whole kid. And we gotta pay attention to a lot of the different ways that these kids are showing up in our schools. But it seems a little overwhelming. So we gotta help educators and those working in schools to figure out, what am I supposed to do with these kids? It seems a little complex. But we're gonna get there. So another concept we gotta pay attention to in a school that we gotta talk about is the body's alarm system. So the old fight, flight, freeze concept. So I'm walking down, I'm going for a nice hike out in Kananaskis, and I see a grizzly. So, I got 3 options. I can run like hell, I could decide to fight, or I freeze, and maybe you won't notice me. But also what takes place with the alarm system is, I don't have a whole lot of time to sit and have a really good think about, I saw a documentary about a grizzly, and it was a black bear, I'm not really sure, what should I do? Don't have time for that. So my body's getting ready to take care of business, keep me safe. And I probably don't have a lot of time to sit down and have that great cathartic cry that I might like to have. Don't have time for that. So really, my body, parts of the brain, getting out of the way so that I can rally and keep myself safe. What does that look like in a school setting? If you've got a kid who's got the alarm system going off, and then they're in a fight mode, lots of hyperactivity, verbal aggression, oppositional behavior, I ain't doing it, limit testing, physical aggression, bouncing off the walls. There's a lot of activity, I'm ready to go. Flight, withdrawal, escaping, running. We have a lot of kids, honestly, they just run. Self-isolation. Freeze. What does that look like? Watchfulness, looking dazed, daydreaming, totally forgetful, don't really quite remember what they're supposed to be doing from one moment to the next, and sometimes overcompliance. So, we have to talk a little bit about the different types of stress that kids can present. Well, actually, not just kids, adults too, all of us. We have things that we can take a look at, positive stress. So that's the good stuff. So it's a brief increase in the heart rate, mild elevation of the stress response. Okay, that's like I'm writing a test, it's like me trying to do this presentation. I'm up, right? There's a little something going on here. Tolerable, it's more serious, it's temporary stress response system is up, but it's buffered by supportive relationships. Toxic stress, This is a term you hear more and more of, and it came out of the Center on the Developing Child out of Harvard. And it is the prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of those protective relationships that help kids figure out, oh, I can come back down. How do I regulate? And if those don't exist, kids can get on overdrive into the threat response system for long periods of time. Not good for the developing brain and body. Another term, ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. Now, many of the other speakers in the series already address adverse childhood experiences and the study related to it. And so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I need to explain a little bit so that we understand some of the science or research that I'm going to introduce. So the bottom line, the adverse childhood experiences are the most basic and long-lasting cause of health risk behaviors, mental illness, social malfunction, disease, disability, death, and healthcare cost. Holy moly. Okay, so when they first started to do this study, what they did is they took a look at 17,000 members. Most were college educated, and most of them were Caucasian. So the details, they're out there. If you could ever get the chance to watch Nadine Burke-Harris deliver her TED Med talk, highly recommend it. But here's the thing. What did they specifically measure? They measured 5 personal experiences. One would be physical, verbal, sexual abuse, and physical and emotional neglect. And the other 5 are related to family members. So for example, a parent who's an alcoholic, a family member who's in jail, and a parent who has a mental health or family member with a mental illness. Each type of trauma counts as 1 ACE. The results of that original study, 36% had 0 ACEs, 26% had 1, 16% had 2, 9.5% had 3, and 12.5% had 4 or more. So just to start to give you a context of the number of ACEs in that population. A little closer to home, the folks up at U of C have started with looking at the Alberta ACE Survey. And what did they find from that initial survey? Demonstrated ACEs are common here in Alberta. There's a strong association between childhood trauma and increased risk for poor health outcomes in adulthood. Half of Alberta adults have experienced family dysfunction, and almost a third of Alberta adults experienced abuse. Those are big numbers that help you set a context for the types of populations we have in our schools. Bottom line, children's health, behavior, ability to learn, and core biology are directly affected by adverse childhood experiences. So the reason why I introduced that, the adverse childhood experience, is we're going to take a look at a study out of Spokane, Washington, conducted by Chris Blagette and his team down at Washington State University. And they took a look at 10 elementary schools across 4 districts. They had a selection of randomly selected K through 6 kids, 2,100 that they looked at. Teachers reported factually what they knew about ACEs exposure, academic challenges, and chronic health concerns. Suspicions weren't reported. So they defined academic problems as being failing to meet grade expectations in 1 or more core subjects, attendance problems severe enough to interfere with academic success, and so school behavior severe enough to interfere with academic success. So when they took a look at the odds for academic and health problems with increasing ACEs, this is what they found. So we're just going to start with 1 ACE. The kid has 1 ACE, they have 1.5 times the chance of academic failure. 2.2 of severe attendance problems, 2.4 times as likely to have severe school behavior concerns, and 2.3 times as likely to reported poor health for kids. What happens when we have 3 or more ACEs? They're 3 times more likely to fail. They're 5 times more likely to have severe attendance problems, 6 times more likely to see the behavior, and 4 times more likely to report poor health. When they took a look at the percent of students with 1 or more academic concerns by ACE exposure, if you didn't have any ACE, you had a 34% chance of having some concerns academically. If you had 1, you had 56% chance. If you had 2, you had 71%. And if you had 3 or more, you had an 80% chance. Yeah. So what do we know for sure about what we see with kids with ACEs? way more likely to see them for discipline, and way more likely to be suspended, a lot more lates and absent days, and far less aspirations and goals. And that's something I just want to highlight quickly. If you're in the threat response system, you're probably not thinking about what you're going to do as a goal 6 months from now, let alone trying to survive the day. So that's one of the reasons why we don't see that with these kids. So what I've learned, one of the things I've learned over the years, you cannot talk about all this stuff without talking about what works. So we are going to take a quick look at solutions that work, and just to give you sort of a few examples, I took this quote out of Addressing Childhood Trauma in DC Schools, that's Washington, DC. Just thought it was one of the things that could set the context for it. So teachers and administrators in schools that develop trauma plans describe implementing changes big and small that quickly led to measurable success, including dramatically reduced number of suspensions and increased test scores. Paper Tigers. This is a documentary directed by James Redford. It reviews Lincoln High School, and it is, as the title says, one high school's unlikely success story. So we're going to take a look at what they did there. I know this documentary is being shown across the U.S. in a variety to school districts, and schools and educators are talking a lot about this documentary. So let's just start with this. The average ACE score for teens at Lincoln High, 4.5. Okay. I just will say that I've done some reading with the principal there, and one of the things that on the first day of school, when he went to work there, as he's walking up to the school, the first thing he saw, all the schools had bars on them. And he noted it was more like going into a jail than a school. And then one of the first things he did was take down the bars. Okay, so what worked here? Staff embraced two key concepts. Number one, toxic stress prevents kids from learning. Number two, moving from a punitive approach to a supportive educational approaches changes behavior. What were their results? What they found over the course of 1 year is that suspensions, and that means kids out of the building, suspensions down 83%. Expulsions, that means you're out, down 40%, and written referrals for discipline, down 47%. Those are pretty staggering numbers. Some research down in Walla Walla, in that area, met with some of the staff, and they did a focus group to find out, hey, what specifically did you guys do to make some changes here? First one, safety. Teachers provided an increased sense of safety, and that's a sense of felt safety, to decrease trauma triggers so that stress response system was not going off all the time, and provided emotionally safe spaces. The other thing, staff expressed hope, teamwork, compassion, and respect. You cannot do this work without hope, and you can't do it without teamwork. More conversations that mattered between staff and students took place, and greater learning occurred and was sustained by students as their own reinforcement of different skills and new normative relations. So that's specifically what they did to make some changes. Let's take a look at it in elementary school. Dorado Elementary School in San Francisco. Before the new approach, this trauma-informed practice thing, they were up at 80 suspensions. They dropped to 89%. Referrals for discipline dropped 74%. Let me talk about 674 down to 50. Pretty dramatic. Metropolitan Business Academy in New Haven, Connecticut. Suspensions dropped by 2/3. College enrollment increased from 48% up to 70% in 2 years. Okay, New York City, the Partnership for Children reports the schools they work with have seen improvements in safety and attendance, as well as significant increases in reading and math scores. We are in the business of teaching and learning, and that's what this is about, raising the achievement for all kids. A little closer to home in Calgary, a number of years ago, we worked with the Trauma Sensitive Schools Initiative, and we had some interviews with stakeholders and got their feedback on that work of creating trauma-sensitive schools. I'm just going to share a couple of those with you. Respondents across the board agreed that the Trauma-Sensitive School Initiative was not a conventional initiative. It was not some sort of new pedagogical technique or new curriculum. It is understood as a paradigm shift. Understanding the impact of trauma on learning And applying trauma-informed practice involves a shift in way educators and educational staff think about students and student behavior. One of our principals involved with the initiative. This is not just common sense. It's about intentionally recognizing how someone else's experience, whether you're a student, whether you're a parent, whether you're a staff member, shapes their behavior and emotions in any given context. Another principle, trauma-informed practice goes hand in hand with the inclusive education policy. If every child, every day experience a trauma-sensitive learning environment, then they're going to meet their academic potential. One of our assistant principals, I've been in the education business a long time and in many different contexts, and this trauma-informed practice is it for these kids. This is the way to meet their needs so that they can learn. I'm just going to end with talking about this final school. It's an elementary school. I can tell you this was one of the schools I saw one of the biggest culture shifts. And this resource teacher is now a principal, and this is what she had to say. This is exactly what we needed here. Our school is described as a chronic stress environment, and it felt like everything we were doing was so self-defeating. Trauma-informed practice helped us shift our entire mindset and to look at things in a different perspective. By doing this work together, as a staff, we will increase student achievement and retain staff. It won't be as hard every day for everybody. So that's the end of part one. Part two, I'm going to take a look at trauma-sensitive schools and what they are. We're going to look at a flexible framework, some approaches to guide practice, school approaches, and lessons learned, and I hope you can join me. Thank you very much.